Good evening and welcome. We're going to get started in just a moment. So I'd like to welcome all of you to the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism's first public event of this fall, co-sponsored by the Overseas Press Club of America. My name is Azmat Khan, and I'm an investigative journalist at the New York Times and the director of the Lee Center here at Columbia Journalism School. At Columbia Journalism School. The Lee Center's mission is to help inform and shape how we practice journalism with a global lens. And I can't think of reporting that so justly honors that mission than that which we'll be hearing about tonight with brave and brilliant journalists Lynzy Billing and Almudena Toral. I'll get to their work in just a moment. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the Overseas Press Club of America, the nation's oldest and largest association of journalists engaged in international news. Key activities include its annual awards, safety training, support for freelancers, press IDs, and events and programming like tonight's. The OPC's How I Did It series convenes freelance journalists and their editors or producers to break down a major feat of reporting. I'm an OPC board member myself, and I'd encourage you to explore joining. There are fact sheets available on each of your chairs. And Executive Director Patricia Kranz is here tonight as well. I know there's also a lot of students in the room, and I would encourage you to apply for the Overseas Press Club Foundation Scholarship. The deadline is December 1st, so definitely be on the lookout for that. A special note to students in our audience, annual membership is drastically reduced, and I would highly consider joining. We're here tonight because in 2019, Lynzy Billing set out to Afghanistan to investigate the murders of her mother and sister in a night raid nearly 30 years earlier. But she quickly found herself uncovering another story, the CIA-backed night raids killing hundreds of civilians with no accountability. Ultimately, Lynzy spent nearly 4 years reporting this out, and she did it as a freelancer. Her sprawling ProPublica investigation was a devastating and unprecedented accounting of civilian loss in Afghanistan, and I couldn't be more in awe of her work. I'm not at all alone in that. She's won a slew of awards for this reporting, including 2 from Columbia and the Overseas Press Club. The Night Raids was awarded Columbia Journalism's Berger Award for an outstanding example of in-depth human interest reporting, and the Overseas Press Club's Ed Cunningham Award for magazine reporting. Her magazine story was meticulously reported, intimately written, and visually harrowing. But as you'll see in just a moment, Lynzy didn't stop there. She also collaborated with visual journalists Almudena Toral and Mauricio Rodriguez Pons on a powerful animated film on the same subject. We'll watch that now, followed by a conversation with Lynzy and Almudena, and time for audience questions, which will be recorded and later online for the public. Please note that tonight's event contains graphic descriptions and images of war casualties. With that, let's watch The Night Doctrine. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd like to introduce tonight's featured guests who made the film that you just watched. Lynzy Billing is an award-winning British investigative journalist of Afghan-Pakistani origins. She's been reporting from Afghanistan since 2019, and before that, she was based in the Philippines, where she reported on topics including the war on drugs and newborn trafficking. She most recently published a harrowing story in New Lines magazine on the devastating environmental impacts of America's long war in Afghanistan. Almudena Toral is an award-winning visual journalist and the executive producer at ProPublica, where she leads the organization's film, television, and video efforts. Previously, she built and led the award-winning enterprise video and documentary team at Univision News Digital. We're so lucky to have both of them here tonight to take you behind the scenes of the Night Doctrine and the broader Night Raids reporting. Please welcome Lynzy and Almudena. I What about now? Oh, yes. There we go. Thank you. So for those who couldn't hear, Lynzy set out to uncover her family's history and what happened to her mother and sister, and quickly found herself telling another story. And I'd love to know, at what point in the reporting did you know that was the story? How long did it take? Was it your meeting with Mazala? Was it something else? And when were you certain?
Yeah. First of all, thank you, all of you, for showing up on a Thursday, taking your Thursday night to come out. It was definitely the meeting with Mazala, who was the woman you saw in the film at the beginning. I was back in Afghanistan at the beginning of 2019, and as you say, Asma, I was kind of looking into my past a bit myself. I hadn't really gone to Afghanistan for any reporting. I didn't have any reporting planned. I didn't have any commissions. And I was in a district of Nangarhar province called Rodat district, and I was approached by some people who said, you need to come meet this woman who was Mazala. And so she started telling me the story of what happened to her two sons, her only two children. And she was a widow. She didn't have anyone really to talk to and to go to find out answers as to what had happened. So I kind of told her, I'll go to provincial officials on your behalf, and I'll see what they say about what happened on this. I went back to Kabul, and I just realized that I just kind of put everything that I was looking into myself on hold. And she really just became this like proper driving force behind looking into this story, because I was just like, this is mad. Like, her two sons have been killed. No one's giving her answers. No one really cares. And so it just shifted everything, and that just became the focus, really.
And, how are you funding this? When did you pitch this? How did you start to think, this is the story and here's where I'm bringing it?
So I started it about that time, March, April 2019. And I was just self-funding it, which is what I do always with all my projects. Because I always start reporting them, and then I try to find a home for them, and I convince an editor this is a really good story. And so I was just self-funding it, and at that point, it was basically just paying taxis to go meet people and talk to them, or for taxis to bring them somewhere safe to talk to me. And I started pitching it later that year in 2019. I pitched the New York Times. They weren't interested. And I then realized, you know what, the best place for this is ProPublica. And I specifically chose ProPublica because there's one editor there, Tracy Weber, who I'd read her work before on hospitals and care homes, and I just thought she was brilliant, and I loved how she treated everyone in her story. She had like this massive care for like how she told stories, and I was like, that's the editor I want to work with, because she's not going to package this in a kind of American narrative on Afghanistan, but she's going to really care how we tell this story. So I pitched Tracy. I slid into her DMs. I dropped her a message on Twitter with a pitch. And she and Steven Engelberg agreed to have a call with me. And as Tracy says, they grilled me on Skype, which they did, and I didn't hear any of it because the power was out in Kabul. We were running on a battery. The Wi-Fi was in and out. I couldn't hear anything they were saying, so I just blagged half of it. But somehow we went ahead with the story. And so that was at the beginning of 2020.
Just in 2016, I think I pitched ProPublica civilian casualties reporting, and they were like, we can't support you in a war zone, and it didn't work out. It was an incredibly difficult process to get interest in those stories. How did you, before you were able to get that commission from them, they take it, they invest in it, how were you affected by that pitching process where someone says no, especially for a lot of freelancers in the audience who have to deal with that? Where did you find support, and where did you draw that kind of confidence that, no, this is a story I have to do. People are going to say no to me, but I'm going to keep pitching. I'm going to self-fund. I'm going to do what I need to do to get it somewhere.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that speaking to that, like, one of the hardest things is when you're freelance and you're pitching publications, they'll either say, we don't support freelancers in conflict zones because we can't support you with security the same as we do our full-time staff. So what I do is I go out and report it, and then I'd pitch them. But then you have editors that say, oh, we don't take work that's already started. We want to have a part in it from the beginning. So they give you it's really a no-win on either front. But I think, you know, when I talked to ProPublica about it, they knew that I'd already been working on it. I was already in Afghanistan. I would have done it anyway. But it is, as you say, Asma, it's really tough, because I think that how do you tell stories from countries if you don't support freelancers, but you also, because you don't want to have a liability with freelancers, but you also don't want your full-time staff to do stories in that area. And so it is tough. And I think much of it, I mean, I don't think I told half of the ProPublica what I got up to as well. Just got on with it.
Also a great tip. When did the two of you start working together, and how did this film emerge? What was the basis for this collaboration?
I think is it working? I think it is. If I don't remember incorrectly, I started at ProPublica actually in 2020. So it was like a little bit after the pandemic started. And I remember this was one of the first projects that I was intrigued by. Tracy, who is Lynzy's editor, amazing editor, told me, you know, like, I know you just started, but, you know, like, I have this amazing story with that freelancer that maybe you should take a look at, because there's all these evidence video. Because Lynzy was compiling all of these videos from people in the villages, right, of like the aftermath of the raids and things like that. So I remember I said, yeah, let's take a look. And I started like being in touch with Lynzy, and we were like looking at this stuff. And then as she was progressing with her reporting, we started thinking a little bit more about, oh wow, like there could really be like a longer video or a short film here. And at the time, I think, if I don't remember incorrectly, we were thinking about a real video, like filming people on camera, getting people on camera. And Lynzy and I started talking about like, oh, wow, so for film, like you can't really include a lot of voices. You really have to sort of like do a little bit of casting, like who could be the best character. And then we started chatting about like what could be like a good, I think it was a similar process that you went through with Tracy, like who could be like, what could be a good raid? It's sort of like you could sort of intersect, like the soldiers were there, your soldier sources were there, and there were civilian casualties, and it was like a representative raid that could sort of crystallize for an audience the big effects of this. And then you started thinking more about like, okay, so these are all the possibilities, because I mean, let me tell you, Lynzy's work was impressive. Like, it's like, honestly, like, I mean, she documented like hundreds of raids by herself, like in the middle of Afghanistan. It's like kind of completely insane, this database, and wow. So, yeah, it's sort of like Lynzy went through all of her stories and then started thinking about, okay, so these could sort of be the matchmaking of both of those. And then we came to sort of like center the film on these stories that you see on screen. What am I leaving out, Lynzy?
Left nothing out. That was everything.
I think it might help to maybe take a look at some of that reporting, to look at some of these photographs and images from from some of these sites and talk a little bit about how how you did some of this reporting and how you cultivated trust with sources. And I just would like to note that there are graphic descriptions and images of war casualties. Let's start with this one, if you can see. Tell us a little bit about who's here on the screen.
This was one raid, one of the very few raids that was actually in a city. It was in Jalalabad. And it was also one of the... Is that on? It was also one of the few raids which was more covered by local media. And it was because it was a bit more controversial. It was 4 brothers who were killed at home, and because of their standing in government and who they were at the time, and it was talked about and it was covered in the media. And this is the cousin who we interviewed about that night, and the reason was because he was, when the raid happened, he also got detained and he got taken back to the base for questioning. And we spoke to a lot of people in that family about what happened that night, including a man who had climbed up a mango tree and had seen the whole raid from the top of the tree, and the neighbors who were hiding out, and just loads of different people with different perspectives on that one night that killed these 4 brothers. And it was one of the first, maybe the first interview we did for the story.
And maybe because they had talked to other media, were they comfortable speaking? What did you have difficulty in conveying what it was you were doing, and taking their photos and images, or what was the kind of consent process like?
Yeah, I think, throughout the story, everybody wanted to talk about what had happened. And precisely because no one had really was very interested to listen to them about what had happened. So it was very comfortable to talk about it. We were a bit wary of where we talked about things, because at the time, this was in 2019, at the time the 0 units were still going out on raids every night, and people really feared them, and people were worried that they were going to come back, or that there was, going to be some kind of reprisal for it. And so we were careful about how we talked to them in that respect. But I think that generally people, they really did want to talk about it. And I think the only thing that I would say is that these were interviews that really spanned like weeks and months, and it wasn't like we sat down and did an interview. We might sit down for 6 hours and do an interview. We'd come back a week later. And part of that is because the way that people recall these incidents is that maybe they'd tell you about the worst moment in that night, where they'd say, oh, this was when he, blindfolded me, or this is when they shot my brother. But I wanted to know all of everything that came before it, right? Or they might say, oh, it happened after prayers or before dinner. But I wanted to know what time that was, so I could kind of corroborate it with what had happened. But I also didn't want to put a lot of pressure on them saying that in the moment. And I think the only advantage was to have space and time to really go back to people and be able to go over the story again with a bit of time in between, so that it wasn't, especially traumatizing in that respect.
And how did you think through the ethics of interviewing someone about trauma and some of the worst nights of their lives? What was your process like?
I think, some of it we were just going to villages and doing proper door knocking, just going from door to door and talking to people, and not asking them about the raids necessarily, but just seeing, if they wanted to talk about it. And people would, tell their neighbors, or, this girl's looking at this, and if you want to talk to her, you can go talk to her. So it was very much a slow process like that. It wasn't, coming in and saying, I'm a reporter from wherever, and talk to me about this. And at the time, actually, I wasn't a reporter for anyone. So I was just talking to them. I didn't have a home for the story or anything like that.
And in thinking through, some of the challenges of, going into people's homes, having these conversations, and then gathering your reporting, verifying it through other means, how did you organize all of that work? Because it was massive. I mean, she went to the sites of 30 of these night raids and documented hundreds of more by a single unit. And it's a lot of content. It's a lot of material. What were you doing to kind of pull all of that together and build the database, for example?
We did a call. I did a call with Tracy recently, and we were talking about this, about having so many buckets of different information and what to do with it. And especially at the beginning of the story, I had no idea what I was doing with it. I was completely overwhelmed. I had no idea what the story was, or the characters, or the narrative arc. It just wasn't there. There wasn't. It was just a lot of conversations and a lot of getting information about these units and how they operated and how they do what they did. But I think in terms of organizing, I mean, it started with, I got leaked a list initially of operations in Afghanistan, and this included the 0 unit operations, which is this unit, but also other kind of sister units doing similar things, which is this idea of local forces being backed by the US. There's a lot of different ones operating at the same time. And mixed in were airstrikes and all these different things going on, and it wasn't a very comprehensive list, but it did have basic things on it like location. It had the dates and the times that these operations happened, and so I think that was what I initially worked off.
And that was the list from the International Human Rights Organization that is described in the written piece, the list that you released.
I don't think.
Not a human rights organization, but an international. It says. I want to make sure I get this right. From a reputable international organization.
There you go. A reputable international organization.
I'm digging. I'm trying to figure this out.
Yeah, so that was the initial bit, a list of the operations. And then I started looking at different security organizations and human rights organizations and journalists and media and all different places to see if I could, corroborate these raids, essentially. And then I started taking that list, I then started looking at how many of these have reported or alleged civilian casualties. And then I had a separate list for that, and then I started going out to those sites to talk to people. And then when I met the people, whether it was eyewitnesses or survivors or families of victims, I then had to get more corroboration and verify, who are these people and who is this person who was killed. And I was basically trying to get, at least 5 sources for all of these different raids. And one thing was that most of them we were not able to, determine who was really killed in it, whether it was a civilian or a combatant. And I think that's really important, because this is just hundreds of other people who nobody knows who they are, who were also killed in operations, but nobody really knows who they are. So,
and as you're sort of thinking through the photos and images you used, what were some of the considerations and some of the, for example, this photo here, in describing where people's faces might appear and the process of even just documenting that visually?
Yeah, we photographed, this one, we photographed everyone. This is Bartur. He was one of the toughest people actually to interview, because he was just completely, he was completely still in like a kind of state of shock about what had happened to his brothers. His brother, one was a teacher and one was a university student, and he and his dad were there when they were killed, and he was a really tough one because when we met him to talk to him, he was really uncomfortable, and so we said, okay, let's move to the roof and we'll talk on the roof, and he like relaxed a bit more. I feel like when I look at that, you can see that he was really still in a kind of, and he's a young guy, he's a 22-year-old guy who lost both his brothers in one night, and was kind of not, sure what to do with himself going forward. But yeah, I mean, we photographed a lot of people with their consent, and I think at the end, visually, we had a lot of things, material to work with in deciding what to include or not. And I obviously wanted everything, and none of my editors did. But yeah.
And I would really encourage you, if you have not already somehow read the ProPublica story, the images in there are incredibly arresting. They're incredibly graphic. I do want to pull up some of those. Some of them are photos she took. Others are those, like this one of Nasibullah, that were provided by family members. What was the conversation like about choosing to publish those photos and showing some of these very graphic images that show the harrowing reality of what this looks like? Because I know that can be a challenge sometimes to get things like this out into the public and seen.
I'll say that it was a big conversation at ProPublica. I mean, by the time Lynzy did years of work, by the time this story published last December, there were a lot of people at ProPublica involved in publishing this, partially because we did this like multimedia piece with it. So there's like text editors, managing editor, editor-in-chief, and then also like an interactive story designer and graphics and animation and video. And so it's a lot of people. It was a big discussion around it internally because there was some sort of split. I think it was one of our really talented designers that was designing the piece that was, she said, I don't feel comfortable publishing these photos. Like, I just feel they're too graphic. And it was interesting because I think at the time, we had a very robust discussion about why some of us argued we should publish these photos. I mean, let me clarify, Lynzy, you'll remember, right? But there were many more graphic photos that we didn't publish. And that was certainly like a very thoughtful process. But we thought pictures like these, for example, we ended up thinking collectively that it was important to publish them after a lot of back and forth, some people against it, some people pro. I think Lynzy's editor, Tracy, we thought it was important to publish them because this is publishing for an international audience. It's way too easy to ignore what Lynzy's amazing reporting was really showing is these raids were killing innocent children and innocent civilians. And while harrowing, these photos were a representation of that in an elegant way. Lynzy, you might want to add more to that.
No, I think yeah, I mean, Alma and I, it was really important to show what was happening. And I also felt like it was almost like I felt like it was almost more wrong not to show it because this was the story. This
and
is
were
what we
people,
wanted to
family members, were they telling you, we really want this, we want people to see this? Was that a part of the argument or conversation you were having too when you were proposing that?
I don't know if we discussed that, but I mean, when they shared the pictures with me, yeah, they definitely they were like, this is, the thing I think that is really important is there is a lot of proof and evidence that people collect themselves, you know, and they wanted to share it because they're like, well, this is my, you know, sons or grandsons, and this is what's happened to them. And so, you know, my side is, well, we should show that, you know, we should really just show what happened.
I'm in a similar camp, and so I really appreciate that you were able to do this and to give such illuminating answers into that process. I do want to ask a little bit about, you know, you were able to capture these photos, you were able to acquire a lot of these images from family members. What was it that made you decide, well, let's do an animated film? What was the basis for that decision, and what were some of the challenges of making a film like that?
It's been so many years that now, like, both of our memories will have to complement each other. But we started talking about making a film. Karen, who is the amazing photographer that took many of these photos, together with Lynzy, who's another amazing photographer. Karen and Lynzy started filming some of the interviews. I remember Lynzy was like, should we start filming some? And I was like, yes, absolutely, yes. So they actually documented, that's why at the end of the film you see some of the real people, because they had documented quite a bit of footage with real video interviews, but also like landscapes, and we were starting to brainstorm, you know, scenes and characters and all of these things. So the idea, I think, was like, okay, we're not going to have video for everything, but it will be like hybrid, like video with a little bit of animation. But then when the US pulled out of Afghanistan and obviously everything was upside down, then it was very clear that we needed to switch more to animation, partially to protect the sources. And at that point, Mauricio, who's a genius and really he's a colleague of ours, he animated the whole film. You see, like at Tribeca, competed against like some films that were animated by 40 people, and that this is all the work of our colleague Mauricio. But yeah, he did an amazing job, really. Like, went from, at the beginning, it was like we were aiming for like a 3 to 5 minute video. At the end of it, after like years and all of these, it became like, I don't think we would have set out to do a 17-minute animated film. But it just, you know, at that point, you're so invested, and the stories were so important, even more important after the US pulled out. And so we just decided, you know, like, we really need to go full in on this. And yeah, then we decided it needed to be fully animated.
Lynzy, can you describe how you kept safe on the ground and who you worked with, and a little bit about the role of Mohammed Rehman Shirzad?
Yeah, Mohammed was one of the first people I met when I went back to Afghanistan in 2019. I did a story on his forensic lab. I don't remember who it was for. So my jet lag kicking in. I did a story on this forensic lab he's this incredibly talented forensic pathologist, and I just thought he was brilliant. And at the time, he was also a government employee, and he had access to certain departments that I didn't, like the forensic database, the statistical department. And I thought he could really help with when we're verifying the identities of people who had been killed. And he was really eager to join on this. And it would quite literally not be possible without him. So it was just me and him, really. And yeah, how do we stay safe? That's a tough one, because I don't know if there's quite an answer for that. I think we did think about when we were going out to certain villages or certain places. We did think if something was a bit off that day, or if there was some issues with different groups of people in the area, we did think, oh, maybe we'll push it till tomorrow. But I don't know. I think it was easier because it was just the two of us. It was a really, it was a small team. We weren't going in with camera crews and security and a sound guy. We were just going ourselves and, yeah.
It's incredible that you tell these stories of Basir and Hadi, as they're called here. What was the process of asking them, to sit down, I think their hands are photographed in the story, to visually represent them here and to walk through the process of cultivating that trust and conveying to them the potential risks they might face as a result of this reporting?
Yeah, Basir and Hadi, at the time, who I called Mr. A and Mr. B, and there's a Mr. C as well, although he's not in the story. They were quite hesitant when I first met them to talk with me, and so it took a bit of time for them to trust me a bit. It took a lot of time for me to trust them also. And we started meeting up, and I would, for example, for their safety, because they were still inside the unit at the time, would find certain restaurants to meet them in or arrange cars to bring them there to meet me. I supplied them with SIM cards and different ways where they would put things on the SIM cards and hand it over to me, and I'd give them a clean one and swap in and out like that. Because they were going through checkpoints every time and going in and out of the base where they have to they couldn't take certain things in and out. But I mean, they knew what they knew what the story was about, and I think they just got to the point where they were like, no, we're going to talk to you about this. They were. Basir was keeping a diary at the time. He had kept a diary, and he'd been noting down all these operations he'd gone on. I spent 2 years asking him if I could see the diary, and it took him 2 years to share it with me. But yeah, it took a lot of time. I think we did everything we could to ensure they were safe, but they knew that it was their choice whether they wanted to talk to me, and they wanted to, so it just continued like that.
And I know the CIA is a black box in so many ways in terms of trying to get answers. What was your process in terms of going to the CIA for comment, going to the Defense Department, which bizarrely gave no comment? Describe some of those reporting efforts as well.
Yeah, I think it was probably nearer the end of the story. I was like, well, I need to reach out to everyone. And I mean, the Defense Department was like, well, you need to talk to the CIA, and they were like, well, this is not the DoD, this is not U.S. military operations. They're putting it in another bucket. Everyone's pointing fingers at each other, right? I'm not even going to try and quote what the CIA said because I'll get it wrong and I'll get in trouble. But it didn't blow me away. It didn't help me massively. Yeah, I think it was super frustrating. It was super frustrating to the point where then I was like, well, you know what? I'm just gonna go to all these people in Congress. And I went to 42 members of Congress. And I said, these are all my questions. This is all my findings. These are all the raids. These are all the civilians who've killed. And maybe like 3 staffers of 3 people came back to me. And they were kind of like, well, we have a huge portfolio we're managing. This is from the Senate Intel Committee. We have a huge portfolio. We're really, we have a lot on our plate. And we don't get answers from the CIA unless we ask the right questions, and we don't ask the right questions if we don't have a majority going forward to ask these questions. And so it was all this kind of like getting nowhere with that. And I when I reached out to Senator Warner, the chairman, he gave me a quote that was almost exactly the same as the CIA quote. And then after we published the story in April, I followed up again and I said, these are all my findings and these are all my questions. And this is the quote you gave me last year. And they replied to the email with the exact same quote. So so that was, we didn't move forward with that very much.
Incredible. What are some lessons you learned from this project? If each of you could maybe just tell the journalists in the room a little bit about what you learned from doing this.
What did I learn from doing this? Well, I've just highlighted one of the biggest frustrations from it, which was not a lot of response. I think I learned, in terms of the writing and reporting,
Whichever lessons or takeaways you want to focus on.
one thing I think that when I went into it is I thought that there was just so much information I wanted to pack in. There were so many people I wanted to pack in. And I was very lucky to have a brilliant editor who was like, we're not packing people into this. We need to tell what the story is. And I was also thinking about like terminology or like military terminology, and we realized people don't really care what gun someone uses when they shoot someone. Nobody cares that the 0 units use M4 guns. They care that someone gets shot. And I think I thought that because reading a lot of past work on like military or intelligence, you just see a lot of jargon, you see a lot of stuff packed in there. And I was like, no, we don't need that. We just need to tell the story as it is. And because I don't want to lose someone along the way. It was like, how do we tell a story where we don't lose someone? And the reality is that we really don't need to go into technicalities of the base or certain things about the unit. And so I learned a lot about that. It's that like cross-section between that narrative. Like when you got like a lot of heavy data, you don't want to pack in all this heavy data. Better to highlight, like in the film, highlight one raid rather than 300 and try fit them all in at risk of losing someone. And also, like, sometimes you read stories and there's a lot of names and there's a lot of villages, and I don't know one village from the other by the end of it, and I didn't want it to be just like all these details in it. It didn't matter. It mattered that there was a pattern of failure within it. And yeah.
I was trying to pick what to say. I'll say that I've learned so much from Lynzy through this process of working with her on this story. It's such a wild story, and from the time you started reporting it to the time it was published, think about it. Like, everything changed in Afghanistan, and it's like perseverance goes a long, long, long way. And I think Lynzy's work is a tremendous example of that. Like, if you're starting out, if nobody knows you, but you have a clear, drive for, no, this is important, and that's you just persevere. You're just DM Tracy Weber on Twitter, and you're just really, I don't know, I found so inspirational how driven Lynzy always was to these stories matter. These stories matter. It's not even about my family. It's these stories matter. Now it is my responsibility to make sure people know about Masala. And then all throughout, even after publication, it's all of the work that goes behind it. It's we've been trying to get a screening in Congress. It's she's really, really, she's shown a lot of perseverance, and I think that's something that we all can learn from as reporters. It's that besides the awards and all of those things, at the end, what matters is that Masala and Basir and Hadi, well, unfortunately not Hadi, but something you don't see in the film, but hopefully if you've read this story, but there's so many behind the scenes. Even the perseverance of how Lynzy has kept in touch with everyone throughout time. Even now, Basir was released from Taliban control, and she was the person that he contacted, and I don't know, I just feel her perseverance and the reporting's perseverance in this case over years and over such harrowing circumstances is something I've learned a lot from.
That's so beautiful. It is extraordinary, courageous work, and thank you so much for sharing that so intimately. Let's open this up to questions. There is a mic in the back of the room. If you want to line up, we can have a continued conversation about this. And please let your questions be questions.
Thank you for this amazing opportunity. I have a question regarding the Zero units. They operate under the CIA program, and their actions are part of their classified war. So how do you deal with classified documents? And maybe I've missed that, but how were you able to approach the base where those people actually were? And how did you build up on this communication when certain things are just classified? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question, because it was also when I started this, I was like, how do I find any documents on this? I didn't find any. It's the short answer. And everyone I spoke to was like, aside from after action reports, there really wasn't much else. And so that's why the story really had to go from, it was very much ground up reporting. It was no one had lists of these raids and these operations and what was going on, and no one was giving it to me. It's not like someone dropped a big stack. I wish they did. It would have been a lot faster. So that was really hard. We're doing it kind of in a backwards, reverse way. We're trying to get to the point where we could go then to the CIA and say, well, these are raids. How many civilians have been killed, and what do your reports show? And all these other questions that we went to them with. And in terms of the bases, we were at that point didn't go into the bases, but the soldiers came out to meet me outside. Although recently I went into the base, so the one in Jalalabad, FOB Fenty, which I wanted to go into for years and never could. And now it's completely empty. There's nothing there. Yeah. How did I what? Sorry? Approach the soldiers. I spent a lot of months trying to find people who knew family members who were part of these units, and there are a lot of guys in these units, in all four. I started getting connected with people, and I said, I'll meet them at a restaurant, and I just told them exactly what I was doing. That's how it started.
Thanks so much to all of you for this conversation. I'm wondering, when the situation on the ground is constantly evolving and you're reporting on something for such a long period of time, how do you incorporate those changes into your final product, and how did you decide that text was the best medium for the story?
Good. All of you have good questions. Stop now. Yeah, everything, like Almu noted before, everything suddenly changed in August. We didn't anticipate it that fast. And then we were literally like, well, what do we do with this story now? These guys aren't going on raids anymore. And where are they going to go? And are they going to get flown out? And are they going to be safe or all right? Or what's going to happen to them? And at that point, I think we might have been 30 drafts in. I don't know how many drafts I did on this story. The first one is horrific. No one should ever see it. It's the worst piece of writing ever. In fact, probably to the 29th one, it was horrific. But at that point, we went completely from scratch. We redid the top, we redid the story, and we said, okay, you know what? Let's tell the story chronologically. Let's go from the beginning and really bring it up to date on what's happening with the soldiers now. And really, up until it got to fact checking, we were still updating it, and we were still the reporting really went until the end, and much with the film as well, right? I mean, we were changing the film constantly as well.
God, poor our colleague, poor Mauricio. I think if he didn't die of a heart attack, I don't think about it. Because yeah, it's like I mean, when you do something animated, it's a lot of work, and it changed so much. Like literally, the whole structure changed, scenes changed, new stuff was added. It was crazy. I guess at that point, I think for all of us, we were just so determined that this story needs to get out. It was more like, I remember there were some conversations about after the US left and everything changed, about the shape of the story, but also even when to publish. Because I remember everyone was publishing about Afghanistan at that time. So then it was like, wait, so there's all these figuring it out. And I'm sure for you, it was like, even like continuing reporting. And then there was, I guess it required a lot of patience, just being like, okay, this deserves the right time to put it out. I mean, ProPublica doesn't really publish breaking news, so it was sort of like an interesting, like, no, we're gonna bet that this is after the Afghanistan craze, this is gonna be more relevant, and there will be new things that will be additive. But there was a moment of freak out. I'm sure for you there was a moment of freak out of like, oh God, this really special story now is like, is it obsolete? What's gonna happen?
Yeah, no, for sure. And we had planned on publishing at the end of 2021. Anyway, it was all planned. And then there was just this huge influx of all these, like, investigative and long-form pieces and all these pieces from Afghanistan. I couldn't even read them all. I had tabs, like, I have to get to that story. I want to read that story. And so we were like, no, we're not going to publish this year. And everyone in the story just did not believe me that the story was ever going to get published. They were like Basir and Heidi and all the families were like, "Are you really working on a story? Because it is not going up." Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Hello. So earlier you said there's no document, but then you also said there's some kind of after-action report. So what's the source for that after-action report? And then to the extent you have never considered going through the Freedom of Information Act route, I was wondering why. Because I just wanted to tell that back in school here, when the professors taught about this FOIA thing, I was not really comprehending it. Later on, when I really tried that myself and then went through all the roadblocks, I just realized there's a community out there. There's a nonprofit organization called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. They would, have these lawyers kind of like line up to help you. And then to the extent you are a journalist, they would go low bono on you. And then when you actually ever get to the so-called appeal stage, meaning you have exhausted all the admin stage where you just do this stuff on your own, they could then sue the U.S. government for information. And to the extent the Freedom of Information exemptions do not cover national security, there's a chance to get those documents out in the public, even though it takes time. But what I'm trying to say is there's that process where you could eventually get that documents released, and then the public sometime down the road could get those information. So I'm sorry to make this statement, but I'm just trying to gather that understanding.
We did FOIA. I haven't heard back. So
Okay.
we have. We and in terms of the after action report, those were we I think it's a little bit of it's covered in the story, but we talked a little bit about who would write up those reports and what would be included. And a big issue with those after action reports was that they wouldn't necessarily include, and I think Asma also probably found this in your reporting also, they weren't including details of who really was killed in it, or much specification, or it's really kind of down to the person who was filling it out, and then it goes up this whole chain of command to whoever it ends up with. So when I said it, in terms of documents, there are after action reports, but I was referring more to like a more comprehensive list of these operations, and the reason for that is because the CIA can take a step back and say, well, these are NDS units, these are Afghan units. This has nothing to do with us. And because it's this idea of like partnering with local forces and this idea of bringing, U.S. special forces from the military over, then they don't fall under that responsibility. And it's this whole like proper carve out of who's responsible. And because of that, who has to write up these reports for that. But I'll let you know if we hear back on our FOIA.
Okay, thank you.
And I will just add on that you can FOIA the Defense Department. There are more challenges to FOIAing the CIA. And the Defense Department will likely say, this is not our jurisdiction, you need to contact this other agency, and we can talk more about the processes behind that and litigation. But suffice to say, Lynzy definitely put in those requests and thought carefully about this.
Hello, Lynzy. Thank you so much for coming here today. The question I had is, at the start of your journey, you were going about a fact-finding mission about your own personal story. And I was wondering how you introduced yourself to the people that you interviewed for that journey. And then did that change once you found a home for the ProPublica story that you published today, or published here?
That's a good question. How did I introduce myself? When I was in Nangarhar, I was meeting a distant relative. I had spent a long time trying to find, because I think I probably started looking at this in my 20s, which is a long time ago now. But I introduced myself as I was just looking for this relative. I didn't introduce myself as a journalist at that point because I wasn't working on the story. And when I started speaking to people who had been caught up in these Syria unit night raids, I don't think I actually told any of them that I'd come back, that I had been looking into my story first. I actually didn't tell my editors until I think it was just on the fly that I mentioned it. I never wanted to be in the story initially, and there was a big discussion of how much I was comfortable being in the story, and that was because I didn't want to distract from what my focus was, which was these current operations which were happening. I didn't want to be like, this backstory of me and why I'd gone back. So there was a lot of to and fro with my editor on what my comfort was on that.
Thank you.
Good, that was a good question.
Hi, first thank you so much for your brilliant reporting. In the film, there's a brief mention that these night raids are similar to night raids that happened in Iraq, in Vietnam, and I'm wondering if in your reporting you discovered any more patterns to these or military doctrines around these. And you also suggest in the film that these will happen again in whatever next war the U.S. conducts. And yeah, if you can provide any other information that you may have found about this kind of pattern of raids.
Yeah, I started, when we talk about Vietnam and Iraq in the film, it's because we started looking at the Phoenix program in Vietnam and the night raids that the U.S. military was conducting there. And there was a lot more documentation on Vietnam than there is on Afghanistan night raids. And I think there was like one commander at the time where they'd done one report and they said it was like they gave a number of like 3% of who they'd captured actually turned out to be combatants versus civilians at the time. And so we mention it in the film, and we mention Iraq in the film because you had these same generals in Iraq that then go over to Afghanistan, and they brought this night raid strategy over to Afghanistan too, despite, when I say failures in Iraq, it's because there was there was a lot of rhetoric about them being successful without much to back that up. And it's like, how do you measure the success of night raids when you're not also talking about the failures of it, or you don't also talk about how many civilians are killed in them? And, they were, in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. And it was, there was definitely a pattern of this for me, it's like, why is the US using this same strategy in so many places, and no one's really like, well, what is the real success of night raids? You know, do you really get the right people? Is your intelligence really accurate at the end of the day? And how are you determining that? And who's checking you on it? And who's monitoring you on it? And I do, like, you know, for me, I do worry about the US using the same strategy in their next war. And, you know, and the same idea with partnering with local forces. When you see US partnering with local forces in countries in Africa now and still in the Middle East, there's no, that didn't stop. And so, yeah, I find that pattern really disturbing personally. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. When the story came out, I got the sense from some of your social media posts that you were a little bit disappointed with the response or certain aspects of it, and you kind of expressed that now with your frustrations with the US authorities. I guess my question is, what were you hoping would be the outcome, or, you know, what were you hoping as a response would be your response?
Yeah. Yeah, I was a bit disappointed because I think I was disappointed because it's hard to. I think I was disappointed because I would have liked to get a response from certain members of Congress, especially ones who say that they're very interested in more oversight of civilian casualties or transparency. And then I realized that they only are interested to talk about that when it's the DoD. Nobody wants to touch anything to do with intelligence, or they just, oh, that's Senate intelligence's job, not ours. I was disappointed because we worked really, really hard to try get their attention and get them to look at our lists and look at our questions. And they weren't interested to. And I felt like I've done all this work and I can't even, you know, I mean, I would call up to try get a contact for a staffer and I would get the phone put down on me. And I'm like, you work in the, you know, you need to give me that staffer's email because I need to talk. So, yeah, I was definitely deflated that I tried to follow up post and say, this is the story of you, you know, will you read it? I've already given you a list of the casualties and I've already sent this, but will you read the finished story? And they weren't that interested too. So, and I forgot your second half to your question.
I was just asking what you were hoping would be the outcome.
Yeah, okay, good, got it. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you, Almudena, and thank you, Lynzy. This was extraordinary reporting, and we're genuinely better for getting to hear about this process. So thank you so much. Let's please give them. And we have the room until 9, so feel free to mingle, to grab snacks, and to chat with these fabulous journalists.